Vig, and first is introduced to Frank. And after he interrogates Frank, Frank essentially figures out what the bad guys are doing in like an hour.
Mm-hmm.
And Brogan, not that Brogan isn't smart, although Frank is very, very smart, but Brogan is so caught up in the way things used to be and the way things, the methods of the past, that the world has sort of passed him by. And, here is this great, great, great figure from, everyone in government knows him. He's captured all these high-profile criminals. And the way I described him was the stoic slugger who can no longer catch up to the fastball. Like Willie Mays batting .211 for the 73 Mets. That's where Brogan is now when we met him. He used to be Willie Mays, but now he's Willie Mays who can't catch up to the fastball. So there's a lot that goes into that, and he wants to go off. He wants to go out with a bang. He wants to, in future novels, in Grit now, he wants to mentor or work or have Frank work with him to help him continue this work that is the moral center of the piece, In Grit, there's Wall Street shenanigans, hedge fund problems, and, the roles are interesting where Frank has to explain to Brogan what is being done and what is wrong, but Brogan has the authority and the contacts and this moral fortitude to get the job done where Frank may not necessarily do it. So that's one side of the whole story.
One interesting thing about... I'm sorry. Go ahead, John.
Go ahead. No, go.
Well, there's an interesting thing about Brogan, and something that we've touched upon before, and I just want to make a mention of this, is that the character Brogan, one of the interesting things about him going through the book, his primary consideration is justice.
Uh-huh.
But the legality is of a lesser priority. In other words, it may not necessarily be legal, but there will be justice.
Yes, yeah, and I think I highlighted that in Grit, especially because I dealt with the hedge fund world and sort of like the beginnings of the whole market meltdown, and I think I made it pretty, it didn't get too, not too much jargon and didn't get too complicated or too technical, but what essentially, I went to great lengths to say that this particular hedge fund they were dealing with wasn't doing anything illegal.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't necessarily the right thing to do, and when it was explained to Brogan that they can take all these hedge funds and private equity funds, they could take all the risks they want, they could risk all their billions and do all these crazy things, but when you put in the cop's pension in there, or the teacher's pension, or the fireman's pension, then it's a different story. And that is the type of thing that once that is pointed out to Brogan, he says, all right, well, we have to do something about this. And then it's dealt with in Brogan's fashion.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe this is a good time for us to start our next series of dramatic readings.
Okay.
So let's go ahead and do that, John. Let's get into our next series of readings on our program.
Chapter 21, October 12, 2002. The best thing that Frank did for himself in years was when he stood up in front of the regular AA group and made this vow aloud. I will live in the moment in my personal life and think long-term in my work life. It was this vow that enabled him to appreciate this afternoon. He was sitting on the couch with Danny watching college football. He knew that the meeting with Brogan would not go well on Monday. Right now, he is the happiest man in New York, rubbing Danny's feet and watching a ball game. Frank rubbed them for a while through her comfy white socks. His part of the deal he made to enable them to stay in on a nice early fall afternoon. She had just dropped off to sleep, her newspaper falling onto the floor by her head. Earlier, they spoke about him moving his stuff in. Her apartment was much nicer and bigger. There wasn't any talk of marriage, not yet, but it was coming. Frank was comfortable with the idea. At peace, he looked over to her. He no longer worried that he wasn't worthy of her. It would always be true, but Danny made her commitment to him so clear and absolute that he knew he would have her love forever. She lay upon her side, her face a little squished against the couch pillow. He marveled at his good fortune. The relationship had moved beyond attraction or devotion. She gave him something he never had, a sense of stillness. With her, he liked himself, a feeling that he never knew he missed and couldn't imagine before now. It was as if he was walking around his whole life with a sickness, a lethargy that he thought was normal. It was how people lived, he thought. Her love cleared the fog, lifted him. He couldn't imagine drinking again when he was with her. Frank's eyes were getting heavy. As he drifted off to sleep, he rubbed Danny's feet a moment longer and heard the announcer yelling about a touchdown. Chapter 23, October 14, 2002. Frank was a bit nervous as he waited for Brogan to come into the office. On the phone from the train on Friday, Brogan seemed slightly disappointed that Frank wasn't coming back with a check. They both had the weekend to think about it, and Frank wasn't sure how this would go. Frank had Weinstein's proposal on his lap and was reading through it for the 10th time this morning when Brogan entered through the side door impeccably dressed as always. He sat and dropped his morning paper on his desk and grunted. Their working relationship was fairly new, and Frank had no way of knowing how Brogan dealt with disappointment. He learned quickly. Brogan propped both of his elbows on the desk, locked his fingers together, and rested his chin on them and leaned forward. "Our client expected a check this morning. How do you propose you get it to him?" It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. Well, Frank thought, the man likes to play hardball and opened the inning with one under the chin. Frank got up, brushed himself off, and dug back into the batter's box. He replied without hesitation. "He'll get his money. We'll get paid also." Frank plopped Weinstein's proposal on the desk. It slid forward and hit up against Brogan's left elbow. He stared at Frank without looking down at the booklet. From the day they met, Frank knew that every word that came from Brogan's mouth was planned in advance. Frank often thought about how exhausting it must be, but that is the way the man was. He figured Brogan would come at him like a hard guy and planned on giving the same, knowing that Brogan had no time for people who backed down easily. Litchfield calling him Brogan's dog stuck in his craw. Frank had guessed that Brogan had many dogs over the years. He wasn't going to be one of them. Brogan reached over to his intercom and pressed a button. Frank could hear the button snap in the silence of the room. "Mr. Brogan?" "Yes, Brian. Coffee, please." Brogan's eyes didn't leave Frank. Frank looked away first to halt the drama of the moment, not in an intimidated way, in a let's-cut-the-BS way. Brogan reached down and drummed his fingers on the booklet. He stretched his fingers out flat and laid them on the desk. He took a breath to calm himself. "The last man who tossed something at me had his hand chopped off. Shall I have Brian pour the coffee or hold your arm down?" It was said in a conversational tone. "Some weather we're having. How about those Mets? Would you like me to cut your hand off?" Frank looked back at Brogan and into those eyes, the eyes of a predator. Brogan's don't mess with me eyes. He understood that he had two clear choices, apologize or lose a hand. "You're right. I'm sorry. That wasn't cool." Brogan leaned back in his chair, having reestablished the boundaries of the relationship. Frank saw that his wiseacre shtick wasn't going to play in this room. Not with this man. Not with Brogan. The door on the left opened and broke the tension. Brian came in wheeling a cart with a silver service set. He seemed surprised to see Frank. He said to Brogan, "My apologies. I didn't realize that Mr. McGinley was here. Would you like me to get another setting?" Brogan swerved in his chair to Brian and then back to Frank. Rather than his anger subsiding, it seemed to be swelling. "Mr. McGinley won't be having coffee. Thanks." "Yes, sir." Brian scurried out after glancing at Frank, his eyes saying, "Poor sucker." Brogan ignored the serving tray and leaned forward again. His voice was quiet, but his tone frightening. "This is not Merrill Lynch or Goldman Sachs, or even one of the marginal firms you worked for in the trading floor. You are assigned a task, and I expect you to produce." His cheeks were red, and his eyes cutting. Frank didn't know whether to crap his pants or answer, so he kept his mouth shut. Brogan continued, "Perhaps our arrangement hasn't been made clear to you. I'm responsible for bringing in clients and the subsequent business opportunities. Your responsibility is to execute that business. Results, Frank. I expect results." He made a fist with both hands, trying to control his anger. "Don't ever speak to me in a dismissive tone. It is unacceptable." Frank rushed to get a word in, more to stop Brogan's momentum than to explain himself. "I'm sorry, really. The guy's a jerk. He wasn't going to—" Brogan raised his hand, and Frank stopped mid-sentence. I'm a man of considerable influence. I've gotten to this level by producing results. The men I hire and their actions are a reflection on me. I will not listen to excuses. Now, back to my original question. How are you going to get our clients their check? Frank was flustered. He didn't know how to answer him. He blurted the first thing he thought of. Am I supposed to rough him up? I don't get it. Brogan leaned back in his chair and smiled. He reached over, grabbed a cup, and poured the steaming coffee, taking it slowly, his grin widening as the cup filled. My influence runs to a very high level. You have considerable flexibility, within limits of course, when it comes to executing your tasks. He lifted the cup to his lips and sipped. They shared a look. Frank's unspoken words were, "You're a scary guy." Brogan's reply was, "Yes, I know." Frank briefly thought about getting the heck out of there. He had allowed himself to get too comfortable with the luxury surroundings and got swept up with Brogan's dignified demeanor. He had lost track of what a frightening presence Brogan could be. This wasn't going to be an ordinary job. Things would get dicey. It would get rough. This was a make-or-break moment. Are you in or are you out? He was in. Once again, he wondered what it was about this man whom he found so compelling. Was it because Frank never had a father? Maybe, but that was too long of a self-examination for now. The appeal at the moment is that he would be able to go back up to Greenwich and smack that little idiot Litchfield around. Frank was smart enough to realize that with each task, every step forward, Brogan would try to pull his strings, but he had a good feeling about him. Not that he wanted to or felt he had much choice, but he liked the old coot. It was that simple. Although the moment was shared and the agreement wordlessly made, Brogan still wanted to keep the upper hand. Scold Frank a bit. I will review this proposal that you so ungraciously presented. This meeting is over. I will see you back here at 2 p.m. Take some time to think about your next steps. Do not come back here unprepared.
Carla got off at the subway at Union Square. She walked east on 16th Street. The day was overcast and there was a cold mist in her face. She had her head down as she walked, fighting off the spray, dressed as a tourist once again with her Yankees cap pulled low on her forehead. Last night was restless. Having returned to the hotel late, she had a hard time settling down. It took a few hours, but she finally fell off and slept in. Carla wanted to be at her best when she confronted Frank, so she thought this afternoon would be a good day for preparation. She will check the terrain and lay the land before acting. She entered Stuyvesant Square Park at the end of 16th, made a left to head towards North 17th. Before getting too close, she sat down on a bench 20 yards or so from the street. From here, she could see the front steps of Frank's apartment, but was out of view from the building's windows. She packed a book and a couple of newspapers for the wait. The weather could prove to be a problem. It would seem too suspicious sitting upon a park bench in the rain for more than a few minutes.